Good morning, it's Tuesday the 12th of December in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Lizzie Burden. Coming up today, not too hot, not too cold. UK wage growth slows at a Goldilocks rate in good news for the Bank of England.
Tory rebels say Sunak's Rwanda plan needs significant changes ahead of today's make or break vote. And risking a cop-out. Negotiators look for a deal on fossil fuels as the end of the climate summit nears. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. UK wage growth slowed in the 3 months through October, and a further sign that the country's labour market is cooling. Average earnings, excluding bonuses, rose 7.3% from a year earlier, down from an upwardly revised 7.8% in the period through September. Bloomberg senior UK economist Dan Hanson says the figures suggest the Bank of England may have done enough to rein in inflationary pressures coming from the labour market.
It's a little bit of a Goldilocks report in some ways, in that you haven't got a huge deterioration or a huge increase, or further deterioration, I should say, in unemployment and in the quantity side of the labour market. But you've also got this cooling in wage growth that will obviously please the policymakers over at Threadneedle Street, over at the Bank of England. So this is something that we've been waiting for a while, really, in the UK. It's the one thing that has been the difference really in the UK compared to the US and the euro area is how fast and how high wage growth has been.
The data come ahead of the Bank of England decision on Thursday, when policymakers are expected to keep rates at a 15-year high of 5.25% for a third straight meeting. MPs will vote on the government's Rwanda bill later in a key test for Rishi Sunak. The Prime Minister is trying to win over rebels like Marc Francois from the right-wing European Research Group, who thinks the deportation plan needs to be tougher.
We all want to stop the boats. There have been 2 legislative attempts at this already. The Nationalities and Borders Act, that didn't quite work. The Illegal Immigration Act, that didn't quite work. So this is kind of 3 strikes and you're out, isn't it?
Francois needs 29 Conservatives to vote against the bill to wreck the government's majority. The delay in Westminster casts doubt over the Prime Minister's pledge to reduce illegal immigration. The Prime Minister also apologised for actions taken during the pandemic. Here's Rishi Sunak speaking at the COVID inquiry.
I just wanted to start by saying how deeply sorry I am to all of those who lost loved ones, family members through the pandemic, and also all those who suffered in the various different ways throughout the pandemic and as a result of the actions were taken.
However, the then-Chancellor defended his signature Eat Out to Help Out scheme after it emerged government scientists hadn't been consulted on it at the time. Sunak argued it was, quote, long-standing practice not to discuss economic or fiscal events with health officials. Talks are ongoing to secure an agreement on the final day of the COP28 climate summit in Dubai. The current draft text suggests countries could reduce their consumption and production of fossil fuels. For many nations who want to see a time frame for a phase-out, that doesn't go nearly far enough. Co-chair at the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, Rachel Kite, says the summit is a mixed bag.
At the end of the day, what delegates were talking about was a report that they have all authored that said that we are not on track. And the text before delegates right now does not put us back on track. And I think that therein is the problem, that we've made progress, but I think until we're closer to being on track to really wrestle with global heating, I don't think we could call it a success.
Rachel Kite says the only solution to climate change is the rapid phase-out of emitting fuels. The clash over fossil fuels has dominated the fortnight of talks after countries failed to reach an agreement at last year's COP27 in Egypt. Alphabet has lost a legal battle to video game developer Epic Games. A federal jury in San Francisco decided that the company's mobile app store has a monopoly over the distribution of programs and payments on its Android software. A US district judge will now decide whether the Google parent must allow payment and app distribution methods outside its own app store. Epic Games lost a similar case with Apple 2 years ago. Alphabet says it plans to challenge the decision. And the troubled Chinese property developer Country Garden is likely to avoid its first default on yuan bonds after most of the holders of a local note agreed not to demand repayment this week. Bloomberg understands that the Shenzhen Stock Exchange met last week with some of the holders of the 800 million yuan security in a bid to secure the outcome. The builder, which defaulted on a dollar bond for the first time in October, is also prepared cash to repay at least a couple of holders of the local note who booked the trend and still planned to exercise their options.
7 a.m. this morning, we got the latest reading of the UK jobs market. Wage growth has decelerated the most in almost 2 years, which should technically lessen the need for more monetary tightening from the Bank of England on Thursday. Traders are looking for 3 cuts next year from Threadneedle Street. They're betting the bank will need to move to boost the economy, and that first decrease is expected in June. Well, for analysis, we're joined now by Bloomberg senior UK economist Dan Hanson. Dan, even though wage growth has slowed, former Bank of England policymaker Andrew Sentance has reacted to these numbers in a Times column this morning. He says the wage increases are worrying and you can't bet on rates having peaked until they're under control. You've taken this print as good news, though, so what's your response to what he says?
Yeah, I mean, I think in fairness to Andrew Sentence, I think his article was written before these numbers this morning. But I think, I think the broad and the big point here is that, yes, the data is good and it looks like wage growth is slowing and by faster than we expected and also by faster than the Bank of England expected. But the point I think he is making is that at 7.3%, depending on which measure you look at, above 7%, let's say, that is still way too fast for inflation to get back to 2%. You need wage growth probably at about 3% to get inflation consistently at 2%. So we're a long way from that level, clearly. But obviously, good news this morning at the margin. There's been more progress than we thought that was going to be made over October. So, I think that's why we've seen it as good news. But I think the big picture is that there's still a long way to go to come down to the levels that are consistent with 2% inflation.
OK, so some optimism to be taken from that. In the context of the broader labour market, though, what else did we learn about the picture facing what is still a very tight market?
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think you've answered your own question, Stephen, that it is still very tight. I mean, there was some good news on vacancies. They continued to drop back. And when I say good news, I mean, this is in the context of how the Bank of England will look at this. Vacancies coming down means there's slightly less labour demand in the economy, so that puts less upward pressure on wages. There's obviously a bit of uncertainty, or quite a lot of uncertainty, actually, if I'm honest, about the state of the quantity side of the labour market because of all these changes that are taking place with the Labour Force Survey, which is the survey that measures the amount of unemployment and the amount of employment in the economy. But if you take the data at face value, what we've had today is a jobs market that has only loosened marginally more relative to what we knew previously, and you've had a bigger slowdown in pay growth. So obviously that's a sort of, if you like, a bit of a Goldilocks scenario for the Bank of England. But as I say, the big picture on pay is that it's still too high to get to 2% inflation, and the labour market is still tight, albeit it is loosening from the extreme tightness that we had sort of over the course of 2022 and early 2023.
Dan, just thinking about Thursday's BOE decision, when you've got markets so convinced that the Bank of England's going to cut rates next year, how much realistically can Andrew Bailey continue with the higher for longer narrative?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard, isn't it, Lizzie? Like they just don't believe what they say. So, and we don't believe it either. We think they'll cut in the summer as well. So I think, I mean, if you're just looking at the meeting this week, our best guess is that they'll just toe the party line and continue to keep the guidance that they've had. The policy is going to remain restricted for an extended period of time. They're just going to keep that and stick with that. I mean, I think this is going to be quite an uneventful meeting, would be my best guess, though the Bank of England does like to surprise, so I don't want to put too much weight on that comment. But, I think there is some talk in the market that they could push back more strongly on what's going on with market pricing and the extent of rate cuts. I don't think they will, just because there's this big risk that they'll turn out to be very, very wrong, and they will have to end up cutting rates. So I think it's going to be more of the same. But I very much doubt they'll say anything that really shifts the dial on market pricing and leads the market to believe that all of a sudden they're out. What is being priced is suddenly very wrong, and the Bank of England doesn't really shift the needle there.
From the unreliable boyfriend to the uncredible boyfriend, perhaps. Bloomberg senior UK economist Dan Hanson, thanks for that analysis.
Well, let's turn next to Westminster, and MPs are voting on Rishi Sunak's flagship immigration policy later today, with a serious chance the Prime Minister could lose. Sunak's own backbenchers spent Monday debating the bill, with some on the right arguing it doesn't go far enough. We've got our UK political editor Kitty Donaldson with us this morning for more. Kitty, good morning to you. What is the scale of the rebellion that Rishi Sunak faces today? Could he really lose this vote?
Morning, and yes, he could. But that's the kind of $1 million question that we're all trying to work out: is what is the strength of the rebellion? And there's sort of a few key numbers you need to keep in mind today. One is 29. 29 is the number of rebels if they vote against the government, will crash the bill at second reading. Second reading is a technical term for the first vote on the bill. But also, we need to watch out for abstentions as well. People who just don't vote either way on the bill. And if around 57 people don't vote, then that could also bring it down, or a mixture of both, people voting against and abstentions.
But to anyone who's just coming to this story and looking at how many prime ministers the UK has had, they'll surely be thinking that the rebels must know that their own party will face electoral oblivion if this is treated as a vote of confidence in the Prime Minister and he loses.
Yeah, absolutely. But they're using it, Lizzie, as a way of holding his feet to the fire, right? But I think we're back in Brexit wars again. The rebels, the hardline pro-Brexit rebels, and this is the same bunch of people who rebelled against Theresa May and eventually brought her down. They almost don't care, right? Because they think it's an existential point. They think that the Tory party will lose the election if they don't show to voters that the Rwanda plan works. And they think that by toughening it up, they will show that to voters. The Prime Minister argues that it's as tough as it can be, and that if they vote it down, basically, it won't go through and it will break international law. Some on the Tory factions are critical of the updated plan. MPs on the right are saying it risks being blocked by the courts again. Well, those on the left, the Wets, the One Nation as we call them, are saying it could ignore international law.
How much or how coherent is that position from the One Nation Tory group as well? Because they're a much larger group than the ERG, and how much sway do they hold within the broader party?
Yes, you're right. Well, the interesting point about them is they claim they have 106 members, which they do, but of those, only 30 are on the backbenches and therefore could rebel against the government without losing their government positions. The strength of the ERG is another question that's up for debate. Basically, it's not just the ERG, it's the ERG plus Friends, the New Conservatives, the Northern Research Group, and another couple of smaller groupings. Whether they combine to make one caucus is unclear at the moment. They've gone in to see, some of them have gone in to see Rishi Sunak for breakfast in Downing Street this morning. I think they're having smoked salmon. And they
very Labour.
Yeah. And they're discussing whether they can back the bill at this stage. And if what's so extraordinary about all this is that it's second reading, right? No, a government hasn't been defeated on second reading since Margaret Thatcher and the Sunday trading laws in the 80s. Most people tend to hold their fire until committee stage, which is when the amendments go down. So if he's defeated tonight, we're into kind of, has he lost the confidence of the party? Keir Starmer will probably stand up and say, this guy can't govern. You know, it's really high stakes stuff, basically.
But if the bill actually passes because of the support of the One Nation conference, are we to conclude that since the return of David Cameron to top off being a foreign secretary, that there's been a marked shift to the centre ground?
I think these people are always there. It's just they're quite quiet, right? They don't make as much noise as as the right wing of the party. I think the other thing is even if the bill passes tonight, and I'm going to go out on a limb, and I think it probably will, even if it does, then, you know, the reprieve is only till after Christmas, when the bill comes back for its committee stages, I think on January the 8th. And that's when loads of amendments will get put down. So even if Rishi Sunak wins tonight, it doesn't mean that he's won outright. He's got more skirmishes to come.
How is Labour playing all of this, Kitty?
They're basically like sitting back with their feet up going, oh my goodness, look at that lot, right? Actually, Keir Starmer's got a speech today in which he will do his I'm the sensible, you know, safe pair of hands shtick that he does all the time, as a kind of marked contrast to the sort of infighting that's going on in the Tory party.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Amazon, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Lizzie Burden.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.